Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this StoryBolt session. While we introduce ourselves in chat and everyone continues to join, I just want to introduce myself really quickly. My name is Obella Obbo. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'll be your host as we unpack the topic of addressing mental health in the new era of work through an authentic story and engaging conversation. Today, I am joined by CEO and founder, Dr. Naseem Abdi, and I will give her a moment to introduce herself and talk a little bit about StoryBolt's mission, vision, and values. Thank you, Naseem. As we jump into our virtual session today, I want to acknowledge my current physical presence in this land is due to the historical and present violence that has been committed upon those who were here before, many of our ancestors. I am joining this session from a location that was originally inhabited by the indigenous Piscataway peoples. We encourage you all to use a link that has just been dropped in the chat to learn more about where you are joining us from today. And to sort of follow suit with that moment of acknowledgement, I would also like to acknowledge all that we might be carrying with us into this conversation about mental health and wellness today, be it the mass shooting in Buffalo or any other unnecessary acts of violence and harm that are perpetrated against the innocent. At StoryBolt, we use the power of storytelling to enable courageous conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and unpack implicit bias, one story at a time, as well as process that experience of harm and struggle that we might be going through. We are going to jump ahead into our community agreements. We will be having some conversation today. And before we dive into that, we want to walk through how we like to guide conversations at StoryBolt. I'm only going to read a couple of these because there are a lot of them, but we'll have them up on the screen for you to peruse for yourself. I'll really focus on having critical curiosity for this particular conversation. So we really want to leave our assumptions at the door, the Zoom door, if you will. Let's not make any guesses about what anyone is saying, but rather, instead of assigning things to their thoughts and intentions, let's ask questions with critical curiosity. And we will have a Q&A portion today that's going to be really diving into what it means to experience mental health in the workplace. And so that will be a great space for you to leave that critical curiosity. And then we'll jump to the next slide. And I really want to hone in on this being present. I know that being on Zoom all day, every day is exhausting. And even if you aren't on Zoom, having to stop to get into Zoom can be exhausting. So we're asking everyone just to be present with us today. Devote your energy to showing up to this space with the most intentional version of yourself that you can bring. As we move forward, I will also point out that we do have closed captioning available for this session, and you can turn that on in the Zoom. And now we are going to kick things off with a little bit of an opening activity. We like to get our muscles sort of going. Naseem talked about building the muscle of empathy, right? We like to get our muscles going and activate our learning muscles for a lens of how we're going to examine the film that's ahead of us. So we are going to participate in a short questionnaire to see where everyone's knowledge and comfort around mental health and wellness rests. To do so, you're going to join us on Slido, which you can do on your phone or computer, and enter into the code 7211226. That is 7211226. And our first question is really just to introduce like the various aspects of mental health and wellness that we can experience. So what comes to mind when you think of mental health and wellness? And just throw that into the chat. So we talked about a journey, or I'm seeing a journey up here. I love that mental health and wellness is absolutely a journey, and there is no real end to that journey. It's ongoing, right? We're seeing challenge and self-care really big on the screen, and I love that. That is probably going to be the meat of what we end up talking about today, right? Is that mental health and wellness is a huge challenge, right? Prioritizing it. It's something that we weren't always taught. It's something that can be spoken about with a lot of like loose language that doesn't always make sense. And then we have to factor in this element of challenge ourselves to participate in self-care without having a clear vision of what self-care always is and what that feels like. We are seeing peace, we're seeing balance, we're seeing priority, we're seeing therapy. I am loving everything that is popping up on the screen. This is juicy. We are seeing self-love. We're seeing trauma and shame. I love that people are willing to talk about that in this space. A lot of what we're going to have a conversation about today is about this film, Is Your Story Making You Sick? Where we're talking about our experience of trauma and how we bring that into our lives, right? And for us specifically in this Zoom room, into the workspace. Understanding good selfishness, I like that. How we handle stress, lots of good stuff. All right, we're gonna jump to our next question. And this is more of a poll, right? I wanna know what aspect of mental health and wellness you feel most comfortable discussing with someone you lead or someone who leads you. If you were having an experience of anxiety, depression, PTSD, bereavement, substance use, is that something that you would find yourself comfortable bringing up to a coworker? We're seeing relationship issues make its way to the top right now. Bereavement and loss, identity. I want to quickly say, this is not a comprehensive list of issues of mental health that come up in the workplace, right? Medication, stigma, disordered eating and body issues, racial identity, gender identity, sexuality. These are all part of a very, very wide spectrum that is mental health. And so we really want to know, what is your relationship to those things and how they might change? What I'm really loving is that it seems like a lot of folks are comfortable bringing up their identity in the space. That is not always easy. And bereavement as well cannot always be easy. It can be very heavy and it's hard to navigate. We're seeing medication really low on the list, and substance use, and body issues. And I think that speaks a lot to what we're going to be talking about as well. And actually, let's dive right into that. So in our second question, I want to know what aspect of mental health and wellness you would feel the least comfortable discussing with someone that you lead, or discussing with someone who leads you, right? Be that a C-suite leadership, be that just your manager, or anything in between. Substance use makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of stigma around substance use, right? That can make it difficult to have those tough conversations. So this is super interesting because relationship issues were high up on the list for things that folks would be super comfortable with. And it is now at the top, right, of what people are least comfortable with. And I think that is really, really speaks to how varied the experience of mental health and wellness is for each individual person. We would have thought that because medication was so low on the last list, it might be at the top here. And yet, even within the same aspect of mental health and wellness, right, we can see a huge diversity of interests. We'll jump to the next question. I feel this aspect of mental health and wellness should be centered as the highest priority within my organization. This is super interesting to me because this is about everyone's personal experience of what they think needs to be addressed the most in these spaces. It, I think, speaks very much to how this conversation will continue to shape that we are seeing anxiety, depression, and or PTSD jump to the top of the list. We're also seeing that as one of the most prevalent issues that folks are experiencing across the board in our everyday work culture. And so I'm really excited to hear folks' thoughts and feelings on what are the ways that they are looking for their organizations to change the environment so that they can speak more freely, or so that they can address their experiences of anxiety, depression, PTSD, as well as what else we're seeing jump to the top here, which is stigma against mental health services, which I think is pretty all-encompassing for what we have right now, and identity, which I think is very topical, and has an interesting way that it weaves into really all of this. All right, thank you all for that engagement. I love taking us off that way. That is the best way to really get our juices flowing for what we have ahead of us. And what is ahead of us now is actually our film screening. So we are going to be watching a 17-minute version of what is actually an hour-long film called Is Your Story Making You Sick? It is a documentary created by an Emmy award-winning director featuring experts like Gabor Mate, Ellen Langer, Dan Siegel, and Carl Hart. The film follows 8 courageous people overcoming trauma, rewriting their stories, and transcending their pain. As a healthy content warning, while containing no graphic imagery, this film does still have mentions of sexual assault and harassment, trauma and PTSD, addiction and substance abuse, and finally child abuse. I would also like to mention that we are watching, like I said, an abbreviated version of the film. So anything that we may see snippets of are things that are really expounded upon in the larger film. All right, everyone, we are going to come back and kick off the next portion of our session, the bit that we are most excited about, or at least that I'm most excited about. All right, so I am going to now invite you to join a conversation with Is Your Story Making You Sick storyteller and director, Frances Causey. Frances is an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker and journalist with 15 years of experience as a senior producer at CNN and previous work held as a New York Times critic's pick. Her films have been seen on Netflix, PBS, and the History Channel, and her TED Talk continues to reach audiences worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us, Frances. I'm so excited about this.
I'm so happy to be with you. It's good to see you again. We kind of had a warm up to this a couple of weeks ago, and I want to thank you and Marina and Dr. Abdi for creating this incredible organization, and just really honored to be here.
Yes, thank you. Before we get started in our conversation, for the folks listening, and I invite and encourage you to use the chat to join the conversation. Please submit your questions in the chat and we will bring as many as we can to our lovely guest. Should you wish to submit an anonymous question, please send it directly to Team StoryBolt or StoryBolt Team. And yeah, let's jump in. Okay, Frances, I am so excited. So thank you again for joining us. Your film, Is Your Story Making You Sick, makes a, I think, pretty radical, but pretty impactful claim that our personal narratives are not our reality, and that through embracing and reframing our stories, we can transform the more traumatic parts of our history that no longer serve us into tangible, psychological, spiritual, emotional, and physical healing. And there are definitely going to be folks who hear that and then they're going to say that's the kumbaya like stuff that doesn't work, or it doesn't have a place, especially in the workplace, you know? And so what do you say to those people?
Oh gosh, well, you hit the nail on the head, right? So I wanted to make this movie because to really kind of demystify and unravel the power of our minds. What is more central to our well-being, to our family's well-being, to our world's well-being, than understanding how our minds work. And when I say mind, I also, there's a spiritual, emotional component, not just our brains, right? The brains are obviously, the brain is part of the mind. It's all one entity. But the main point I really wanted to make with the movie was that we are science is showing that we about 95 to 96% of the time, Obella, we are living in the past and we don't know it, right? And so what does that mean? If you could imagine, well, there's good parts to living in the past, right? There's your 6th birthday party, was a pleasant experience. Unfortunately, our minds kind of have a tendency to hold on to the negative. And this is showing up, just in 1980 did they actually come up with post-traumatic stress. and give it a DSM-4 code and all those kind of things. And then there's the seminal epidemiological study on ACEs, adverse childhood experience. Now, I know a lot of people are saying, well, I had a great childhood, right? Well, even seeing your parents argue can create a memory that's so upsetting for people that what it does is it's kicked into long-term storage where it doesn't belong because it hasn't been reconciled. So if you're at the water cooler at your work, right? And so let's be honest, right? Your employer, just like I'm an employer, I want to get the most on a base level, I want to get the most productivity I can out of my employees, right? And to do that, you have to care about them. You have to care about their whole being, right? And so if you really want to talk about the kumbaya stuff, just think, if you don't think the mind controls your life, then how do you think you wiggle your big toe? Right? And so what we do is we are constantly projecting this narrative of who, what we think we are. We're constantly projecting it out into the world, and it may be someone else's image. If you had a sixth grade teacher who critiqued maybe unfairly a painting, or maybe your father got laid off in his job. These are things that we're constantly absorbing and taking in, and unfortunately, if we don't deal with them in real time, which most of us don't, there's a pretty big prohibition against mental health. There's all kind. We have a very fast-paced society. We're human doings and not human beings, and so there are a lot of prohibitions against doing that. But against looking at your thoughts. But what I would encourage everyone on the Zoom call and in your wider world to look at, if you're upset or you're angry or you're sad or you have a negative emotion, chances are you are not upset for the reasons you think. Right? In present time. Usually it's something that has gone on in the past. And the only way to really do that, I think the only way to become a true empath, right? And what is empath, right? What's empathy, right? It's the ability to share and understand the feelings of others, right? So if you're playing out this drama in your mind each day, and how can you change what you don't know you have, right? How can you change if you don't know it exists? That's where mindfulness comes in. And that's why we made the movie. So I would argue to the naysayers that everything you do comes down to mindfulness and is in your mind. And if you really want to get the most, if you care about your employees, it's a very close-knit, you have a community, you have a culture. It's kind of like one bad egg can spoil the whole bunch, right? And so being mindful and supporting mindfulness to understand that folks might be dealing with stuff. Now, there are ways to deal with stuff with boundaries and that don't necessarily are out there in the open. I mean, we are all as unique as our fingerprints, right? In terms of where we are and what the issues we have. But that would be my answer.
I love that. No, but it's the right one. And I think, so Dr. John Gottman, who is like a pretty famous couples counselor, he talks about how if you want to know how a couple is doing, you could ask them like a series of questions and like assess, or you could check the cortisol levels in the urine of their children, right? And get a better idea than anything that test could give you, because even completely unaware, they're absorbing so much of what's happening around them. And that stuff is obviously going to stick with you. So I really love that answer. And maybe a little bit to that point, I think trauma is kind of like a big word these days, and I think it scares people away from how common it is. Right. And so I would ask you, like, what do you think counts as trauma, and the difference between this work of like reframing versus how we can sometimes minimize your own experience?
Right. Well, let's be really honest about the bias against mental health in our society. This is hard to look at these things. It's very hard to acknowledge. And I do encourage people to look at the ACE study and take the ACE test and understand if as they say, and again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I read the study and I also looked at my own life. I'm really fortunate to be able to make films on subjects that I'm really curious about. And this was something that I grew up with. I grew up with a lot of trauma, parents divorced, lots of associated problems relating to that. And I wanted to understand how it impacted me. And so if you think there's something that's just not right, chances are there's something that's just not right that's impacting your psyche. So, and you don't even have to call it trauma. Call it stress. And you spoke of transgenerational stress, right? And so it's sometimes it's very hugely easier for human beings to look at the impact of stress or trauma even on their physical life, right? And then we, because the mind is so opaque and so, kind of, it's a big thing, right? But we know when our adrenal system is shot with cortisol, right? And where that all starts is within our perception of the world. We are taking in the world from the minute, I didn't include it in the film, but there's a lot of great science on pre and perinatal stress, right? So the infant, the baby in utero is taking on the stress of a mother, right? And so the baby's getting, bombarded with all this cortisol. And so what happens is, you look at Bruce Lipton's work, you look at Gabor Mate's work, right? Bruce wrote an amazing book in 2009 called The Biology of Belief, right? And I won't go into so many details. It's great to read if you can. But he's a cellular biologist, and he looked at, it wasn't so much the DNA within a cell that was determining how your life would turn out. It's the environment in which that cell is operating, right? And he could see that the outside of the cell was vulnerable to things, to stressors, right? So if you can't get behind the idea that maybe you had trauma, or everybody, a lot of people, 50% of people's parents divorce, or yes, you see your parents arguing, which is on the ACE study, right? Just think about in terms of what we now know about science and the role of stress, right? And so again, the whole point of the film is listen to your thoughts. What are you telling yourself? And the hard part is that a lot of times it's hard to believe that what you are telling yourself might not be true. And so whenever you have an upset, or whenever you get angry, or and you don't know where it's coming from, maybe if you could say to yourself, okay, well, let me take this back. Let me walk this back. And usually it ends up is something that happened in our childhood. But to do that, you have to really be mindful and conscious and understand and accept the premise that 96% of what we feed, this is Bruce's work, 96% of what we say, think, do is really triggered by the past. And that's a really hard thing for people to grasp. But so what do you have to do, right, Obella? You have to, when you look at the past, you have to look at uncomfortable feelings, right? We have a hard time in our society with feelings. Your feelings are who you are, and they are a roadmap to your psyche. And there's millions of books out there. You don't necessarily have to go to therapy to find out those things. I mean, there's so much out there that can, the body keeps the score, the biology of belief. I think there's I hope Nick will share the study guide, but it's just like I just made a film called The Long Shadow, which is about systemic anti-Black racism in our country. And I started on that because I grew up in the South and I saw it around me. And one of the things that's really been hard for Americans to understand is that we created this system from our founding, right? It's really hard for people to understand that maybe their thoughts, wow, I'm living back when I was 6, when nobody showed up to my birthday party, or my father yelled at me. But the science is supporting that what happens is you shut down when things like that happen. And so there are these microaggressions, I think, that happen as children that have this cumulative effect where the sum of the parts equals the whole. And I would say to all the managers and business owners out there that your business culture is your system. And what is that system made up of? Is it made up with honesty and transparency? And, I mean, we can't all fall into a heap, at the water cooler, but you can create a healthy, holistic system for your employees that ultimately is going to make them happier and also make them better at what they do. I believe that.
Oh, I love that. And I think this conversation about belief and how we see ourselves as a function of the system is really valuable and impactful. I'm going to bring in something that I remember from the film, and then I'm going to ask one of the audience questions, and it kind of is a combination of some audience questions. But Gabor Mate, which I loved his inclusion in the film, he talks about the commonalities around folks with chronic illness. And he says, cognizance of the needs of others, a sense of duty, role and responsibility, difficulty expressing anger. And those are the things that we really are asking of our workforce, to be honest, right? That is a lot of the culture that we're building in the workplace already. And so we got a great question that sort of talked about or asked how you suggest we approach addressing our trauma in the workplace without it being perceived as an excuse for not working harder, understanding that what they're asking of us might even be contributing to the reason that it's so hard. Does that make sense? Yes.
Well, I think, so again, it's individualistic, right? So it's system dynamics, right? If you have a situation that's not really working at work, I think you really have to have acceptance that it's not working, right? And then you've got to figure out, there's all kinds of programs. Maybe you go on one of the workshops that, for instance, that the people in the show went to, right? So we filmed them over a year, 4 different 4-day workshops, right? And these were mindfulness workshops. They were specific to trauma, but there are other workshops that are available in other ways to kind of do team building. And I'm not, and yeah, the ones where the trapeze out in the woods, and you fall back, and their trust building exercises, all of those are very revealing. But I think you have to accept that your workforce they're complicated. They're bringing a lot of stuff to the table. Sometimes a lot of it's not great. And you have to have, I think, this holistic commitment to your workers, their mind, body, and soul, not just what they're doing, in terms of productivity, right? And so I think it's going to take a while, just like it's taking with systemic racism in our society. I talk a lot on Zooms that I do with folks. It's like, this is not going to happen overnight, right? We're not going to undo what's taken 400 and something years to get here. We're not, so have patience, right? And I think being aware as a manager or as a business owner that these are the kind of people that you want to attract. And the way you attract that is you tell them that you care about them, right? Usually the first 10 minutes of my Zooms that I have with my team is what I try to do, because I am a workaholic, which is a vestige from my past, right? That was definitely something that was taught to me, that if you work hard and you achieve, then we will love you, right? And so I have a tendency to work too hard. Part of that has really been hard for me to understand my thoughts about that, because I'd like to think my outsides match my insides, right? And I love what I do, and I've, you know, I'm fortunate, right, that my insides do match my outsides. But the first 5 or 10 minutes, I really want to know how they're doing, and what's on their mind, and how are their spouses doing, and how are their kids doing. So I think there's a lot more we could be doing to not look so much at the bottom line, because I think if you look at these things and you support these things and you create this environment, your bottom line is going to improve. There's just no question.
Thank you so much.
I hope I answered your question.
It does. It does.
Okay.
And it starts it, knowing that all of this is, of course, a big dialogue. But we are coming up to the end of the session. So I'm going to ask one final question and sort of keeping it within the theme. Well, one quick thing that I'll say to all of our guests, we got a lot of questions that were around resources. You will be receiving after this session, and even in this session, links to a resource guide that will have access to the kit if you would like to see the kit that Frances brought up, as well as some other resources, and anything else that you're looking for. Please feel free to reach out to us. It is very much the work that StoryBolt is trying to do, to be a partner in this process, as Nassim said so eloquently at the beginning of our conversation. But for our last question, I would love to quickly just ask you, for leading in the new era of work, prioritizing mental health, what do you really want in, maybe one final sentence, what do you really want folks to take from the film?
That's easy. Listen to what you're telling yourself and ask yourself if that's true based on the circumstances of the present moment. Listen to your thoughts. It's a ticker tape. And if it is a ticker tape, then find a way to slow down, because that's where you will truly realize in those silent spaces between thoughts, that's where you will truly, truly live your most authentic, most fantastic life.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Frances. That was everything. And we have so much to walk away from. Before folks run off, I would love to grab you for a quick little closing remark. But thank you again so much, Frances. And then I'm going to invite Tim Davison, who is the CRO of StoryBolt, to talk a little bit about what StoryBolt has to offer. And then we will be dropping some resources in the chat, as well as a survey/services assessment that we would love for folks to fill out while Tim talks to us. It'll be very brief, about 5 minutes, but come on in, Tim. Yeah, thank you, Tim. So again, just to wrap us up and really to bring this all together, as you've already seen in the chat, there is a survey for you all to fill out, and there's also a resource guide. That resource guide contains a section called What's Next, which are resources to educate yourself, ways to donate and give time, other access to information that you might need. We will also continue to update that with some of the information that Frances gave us today, so that it is something that you can revisit and gather from. So please keep that link and keep that resource. You also see some self-reflection questions in there that'll give you the opportunity to really dive in with yourself and with people around you on how mental health might show up in the workplace, and ways that you can advocate for yourself and advocate for others. And then again, we just want to hear from you. So please fill out that assessment so we can get an idea of how we can continue to serve you in the StoryBolt environment. And so we are going to wrap up today with a quote, which we love to do. And this quote is from the film, and it is one that resonated with me really well. We are authors of our own stories. Our stories are always evolving, and this is just one more opportunity to come back to what you're choosing to write and to create for yourself. So we ask you to grab a hold of your own stories here at StoryBolt and share them as a function of building a better workplace and building a better you. And have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you all so much. You'll see Tim's email in the chat, and then there will be other ways to connect us on the resource guide. Please reach out. I loved this conversation today, and we're really thankful for you all. Have a great rest of your afternoon.